Okay, so let's get started. Welcome to the webinar. My name is Munseob Lee. I'm an assistant professor at the University of California, San Diego. So this is the Seoul National University, UC San Diego, the joint webinar series. So I'm organizing this with Professor Jihong Lee at the Seoul National University. So he's also joining us as a panel today. So today we are very happy to have Professor Jihong Lee from Seoul National University. So in the spring quarter, we organized the two webinars, and this is the first webinar. So let me quickly introduce the second webinar scheduled in May. So in May, we will have Professor Sang-Yun Park from the Hong Kong University, the Business School. So he will share the fascinating, recent academic research on the economic costs of trade sanctions, the evidence from the North Korea. So if you are interested in the issues of the North Korea, or if you happen to be interested in the issues of the sanctions, due to the other things happening in the world these days, so it'll be really interesting to see what we can learn from our experience during the 2010s on the trade sanction on North Korea. Okay, so going back to today's event. So let me give a quick brief introduction on today's speaker, and then I will give a floor to Jihong. So Professor Jihong Lee is the professor of economics at Seoul National University. So before joining SNU, he has been an assistant professor at the Birkbeck, the University of London, and Yonsei University. So his research interest includes the game theory, industrial organization, and economics of innovation. So Professor Lee leads a research team that tracks the patent data, both domestic and international. So he will share the findings and the views on who innovates in Korea. Okay, Jihong, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Let me share my screen. Okay, does this work?
Yes, this works perfect. So I just forgot one thing for the audience joining us through the Zoom. So whenever you have any question, please leave those on the Q&A box on the Zoom. So after the 30 to 40 minutes, we will have a Q&A session. So feel free to leave any questions on the Q&A box in the meantime. Thank you.
Thank you. So today's talk is based on a series of work that I've been undertaking since about 10 years ago, looking at innovation, both in terms of theory and in terms of empirics. This is an important topic, in particular for the country that I'm currently working in, because Korea grew as sort of input China. You put in lots of input, labor, capital, and then grow. But then, at some point, these things stop working, and then you have to innovate. You have to innovate and improve productivity to survive. And Korea has sort of done that, since 2000s. It has become a global leader in innovation. You've got, Samsung S22, Galaxy S22, which is, in my view, a very competitive product right at the frontier of mobile phones. But how do we measure Korea's innovation? What can we make of Korea's innovation? Can we say something about its performance, not just today, but tomorrow? One way we say, well, not just us, but lots of people in economics and business circles, to do that is to look at patterns. It's not complete because there are many ways of innovations taking place, but these innovations, by their very definition, are very difficult to record. I innovate as a person, organizations innovate, regulations innovate, not just products. But some innovations are recorded, okay? And that gives this patent data. And patents are obviously, as I said, partial, but it's concrete, and it gives us lots of information. On the one hand, it gives these one size of innovation in that, you can think of the number of patents of a company or a university as the size of innovation, but at the same time, you can look at its citations. A paper, an academic paper you think of as a good paper, on average, if it gets cited a lot. Of course, little citation doesn't mean that it's a bad paper or bad patent, but you think of good citations as good thing about the quality of innovation. Okay, not just that, the patent system, the intellectual property rights system, gives a very detailed and comprehensive classification of technologies. And these classes change over time. So you can track what's going on. What are the new technologies? Okay, what is changing in terms of the structure of the economy? Okay, so what I've been doing on the data side, which I'm going to talk about, not the theory side, we have named this project as Korea Patent Data Project, or KPP. So we've copied innovatively NBER PDP. Okay. I mean, this is one way innovation happens, you copy, okay? So instead of NBER PDP, we have KPP, okay? What we've done is we take lots of patents, not just from Korea, but all around the world, okay, that have been assigned to people or companies in Korea, and then match these things to Korean firm data, okay? And we have been more recently matching that data set to other data sets like labor things and insurance and stuff like that. So, the universe of KPP is expanding largely due to efforts of various people, mostly my students, okay, both home and abroad. Okay, so let me just, since many people may not have seen patents in reality, so here's a sample patent. This is one from the US. So this is a sample of US patent, okay? There are lots of things, okay? You can see just from the first page, okay? It even has an abstract. Just to highlight, it starts with this kind of information. It is a United States patent. It has a patent number. What it means is that it's this is a number that you can track, okay? It's an important piece of information out of millions and billions of data points that you can sort of crawl, okay? It also has a date of patent, which means it's the date of registration, okay? Now, if you come back to the left panel of what's below that I've enlarged, you can see lots of other things, amongst which, if you go to number 22, sort of in the middle, there's another date. That's the date of application. So you submit patent application in 2011, and it comes out registered in 2013. So typically there is 2-3 year gap between application and registration, okay? And it also has a name, the title, of course, but it has these two important informations. One is the information on inventors, the other assignee. These two are typically different. Assignee is typically an institution, mostly companies. Inventors are individuals who work for the company. Patent belongs to the assignee, okay, typically. And it also has addresses of these guys. So in this particular patent, both the assignee and the inventor are located in Japan, okay? It's not just country. You also see a location within the country, hamamatsu, okay? It's a geographic definition which is smaller than a country, okay? and various other things. It has classification, 51 and 52 give classification. One is international classification system, the other is US classification system. These things also complicate how to compile the data together because there are actually multiple classification systems, which I will talk about later. Then we've got citation information. So this 56 gives all the patents that this particular patent cites. Okay, so there are what? 6 patents that this cites. Some of these patents are cited patents are forwarded by the applicant itself or the assigned itself. But some citations are added by the examiners, okay? These things are important not just because the cited references are important and relevant for this particular technology, but also these citations kind of demarcate the boundaries of these intellectual property rights. And they can be important for litigations and other potential fights over the intellectual property rights, which can often be quite vague. Okay, so that's sort of a basic sample of a patent. As I say, you know, there's lots of information, and information is often typically recorded in words. Okay, there's also abstract. So you can think of millions of such patents coming out every day just in the US. Okay, and these patents have been around since the days of what? George Washington. Okay, so what am I going to do with these things today? I'm going to tell you where Korea is first in terms of the sort of international standing. Okay, what I've done here is let me just take the US patents, okay, just to, you know, make the talk more focused. I've just taken all US patents, and these patents are called utility patents. Okay, there are design patents too. Okay, let's forget about those design patents. Just look at utility patents like, you know, herbicide, fungicide, you know, fertilizers, you know, that kind of thing, machinery and stuff. Okay, and what I've done here is a data starting from 1976 to 2015. So 40 years, okay, 40 years of all utility patents approved, okay, by the US Patent Office, USPTO. And what I've done is I've taken 4 cohorts of 10 years each, starting from 1976 to 1975 to the most recent 2006 to 2015. And I've taken the total number of utility patents, and you can see that the total number of patents in the US has been rapidly increasing. So in the 70s, in the first cohort, there were 600,000 patents granted. And then the next decade, 900,000, then 1.5 million, and then over 2 million. Okay. And amongst this, who have produced the largest number of patents? US. It's the home country. US is also the most active innovator. And it's also gone from strength to strength, from 300,000 or 350,000, 370,000 in the first cohort to over 1 million in the latest cohort. Number 1 throughout. Japan, number 2 throughout. Okay. Germany, number 3 throughout. So these 3 are top 3. Korea, on the other hand, started off really as a tiny little innovator with just 169 patents between 1976 and 1985. But then you can see that, you know, it became what? A powerhouse, okay, in less than 20 years effectively, because in the second cohort, it was still pretty small. It really grew during the late 90s, during the 90s and then on, okay? From, the second cohort to the third cohort, it, went from 40,000 to over 30,000, and then it became over, 100,000. And by the last cohort, it was number 4 in the list. Okay, overtaking the European Union as a whole. Okay, so just looking at the numbers, you can see that Korea did really achieve, that jump. Okay, from an economy that just puts in inputs to grow to a country that actually innovates to grow. Okay. Now, after 2016, things have become even more, this trend kind of stayed after 2016. Okay, Korea went to number 3 at one point, but then there's another dark horse here, which is China. So China is down here, okay, sort of towards the bottom, okay. But then after 2006, it's really, coming to a big force. And I think in 2021, looking at the simple count, I think they became number 3. Taiwan is a big competitor of Korea's, and it's sort of, you can see the trend, which is very similar to Korea. Okay, so Taiwan is right above Korea in the 70s, and it was right above Korea in the 90s and 2000s. But in the sort of latest decade, Korea has sort of seems to have overtaken Taiwan a little bit, but sort of neck and neck. You can think of that. Okay. Now, the problem with that measure of innovation is that it doesn't take into account quality. Okay, you can write as many papers as you want, but if you don't have a single, killer paper, then, you might not be regarded as well, right? And similar to patents, okay? Similar to this, people have talked about measuring the quality of innovation. There are actually many ways of measuring innovation quality, lots of ways. And I don't want to go into all those details. I just want to tell you the simplest way of measuring innovation in the literature, okay? One is to look at citations as I mentioned before, okay? These guys, Holiaf and Trattenberg, who were behind.
So Jihong, let me check one thing. So maybe the screen is frozen. We still see the table. So could you move around the slide once again? Okay, so now we see the screen. Okay, it looks good now. Yeah, please go ahead.
Thanks. So, the NBER PDP guys, they were first to talk about patent citations rigorously, that patent citations do contain important value. So that is quality measure, okay, or one quality measure. What we do is make things even simpler than these guys. We look at what's known as Hersch Index that has been used a lot in academic circles. Hersch Index is just if an author of papers like me has total N papers, H index means that I've got more than H papers that have been cited at least H times. Okay, so we can use that into patents, and that's what I did with 2 colleagues, Simon Lee and Sunu Kwan. Okay, both are in the East Coast of the US now. Okay, working. Okay. So we use that simple measure, H index, amongst other things, to sort of rank different countries. Okay, and how do we? Before I explain this, how do we define a particular country's patent, or a patent? How do we define a patent belonging to a particular country? We look at here a number 73 information, the assignee location. Okay, so there can be multiple assignees, of course, but we just look at the first assignee's location. Okay, so in this particular case, the patent belongs to Japan. Okay, So we are not looking at the inventor location. We look at the assignee location. Okay. Now here's the same ranking as the table I showed to you before, but with HIndex. If you look at HIndex, and I highlighted Korea, okay, the numbers are still rising over time. Okay, from rank 14 to 13, then to 10, then to 8. But you can see clearly that the numbers aren't quite as impressive as these numbers. Okay, so as soon as you start to think about the quality of innovation, not just the quantity of innovation, we may actually see a slightly different picture about the strength of Korean innovation. Okay, certainly with citations, Korea's performance isn't as impressive as just looking at the quantity. And this HIndex is just one index, but we've looked at multiple indices and they all point to the same thing, at least in terms of patterns. Okay, so that's the first thing I would like to tell you today. Quantity, pretty impressive. Quality included, impressive, but not so impressive. Okay, so the next thing I'd like to tell you is what Korea does. Okay, and then at the end, I'll tell you who does it. Okay, so in order to answer this question, we have to disaggregate innovation measure. Okay, we use classifications. Okay, as I said, there are multiple pattern classifications. USPC, IPC, United States Patent Classification, and International Patent Classification. The problem is, since 2006, US started to change its classification system from USPC to CPC. CPC is known as Cooperative Patent Classification. The reason that they changed CPC from USPC to CPC, their classification system, is to merge their system with that of Europe. Okay, so before Europe had its own classification system based on IPC, and the concordance is a problem, obviously. So they have been trying to rectify this by using one single system. Okay. And that's one reason why the data stopped, I mean, at least for this talk, data stopped at 2015, okay? So I'm going to use USPC, okay, to disaggregate innovation measure amongst these US patents across different countries. You can see different patterns of the evolution of economic or at least technological structure across time. I'm going to use USPC to count most popular technologies of each decade. And then I'm going to use CPC later to look at technologies that are relevant for the fourth industrial revolution, okay? And you need to use CPC to do that. And I'll tell you the differences in a minute, okay? And this particular work is based on another previous work of mine with two other people, Lee, Lim, and Jihong. Okay, so let's begin with US patent classification, USPC. Okay, so there are, it's a tree structure, okay, and it has sort of the highest levels of disaggregation known as classes, and then below each class, there are multiple subclasses. And as there are more and more new technologies, you can naturally expect more classes appearing over time, and that this is exactly that, especially in the number of subclasses. So from the 70s, the number has doubled effectively. So there are more new technologies, okay? Okay, and did you see this slide, by the way? I'm having a little trouble moving back and forth. Did you see this slide?
Yeah, we see that you're experiencing the problem, but we see the slides well. So whenever, yeah, we have a problem, I will let you know.
Okay. Anyway, so the point is that US patent classification is itself a little subject of study. Okay, you have to study that a little bit to sort of get to grips with what it tells you. Okay, that's what it is. Okay, what this slide is basically about. Okay, classes and subclasses. There are different varieties of how these classes and subclasses are defined. Each class is identified by one number, two numbers, or even three numbers. Okay, each subclasses tell you different things with different codes, you know, numbers and alphabets, sometimes both combined. So you just need to see different patterns long enough to sort of understand the nitty-gritty of these things. And also USPC, one thing to note is that there's a main classification and sub sort of classifications. The main classification is a single classification called original classification. Okay, so if you go back to this, you will see in number 52, okay, towards the bottom, you've got one number that's in bold. Okay, that's the main original classification. And you've got multiple cross-references which are not in bold. Okay. Okay. So the black one, the bold one, is the major type of technology, okay, that USPTO has given to this patent. Okay. So you can see these are sort of classes, different classes. Okay. Okay. So what we've done with these classification systems is to count the 10 most popular classes per decade. Okay. Actually, we've done this using multiple measures, but I'm just going to give you the simplest one. That is the simple count. So cohort 1, the first table here tells you
we still see the example screen. Could you try to move the slide a little bit more? Yes, we now see the count table. Okay, so the two tables here. The first table at the top is the 10 most popular classes by count in the cohort, in the decade going from 76 to 85. The second table is the same thing from 86 to 95. Can you see this? This is yes. The first table here is 96 to 05. The last table is 06 to 15. Now, what are the color schemes? The color schemes are overlaps, okay? So the yellow appear in 1 and 2, the first and second tables, okay? They're the same things, okay? So let's look at this. So in table number 1, we've got chemistry, drug, compositions, surgery, internal combustion engines, and so on. Chemistry, there are lots of chemistry, chemical stuff. And then we come to number 2, you know, still lots of chemical stuff because the yellow, by and large, still survive in the second table. Okay, so the economic structure has changed, did change, going from table 1 to table 2, but not that much.
But of course, you see some like radiant energy and stuff like that coming along in table 2. Now things change a lot, okay, in this page, okay? So the yellow things disappear pretty much by the 90s, okay? And new things emerge, okay? The new things are these purple ones, okay? So you can see economic structure, not around the world, okay? The nice thing about USPTO data is that every country comes to promote its good technology there, okay? So USPTO is regarded as sort of frontier patent market. Okay, so you can see the sort of globally important economic structure here, if you like. Okay, and going from the previous slide to this slide, you can see, you know, something drastically changed since the 90s. The IT revolution, basically. So you see in table number 3, you see semiconductor right at the top. In table 4, you see semiconductor still there in top 5, okay, with even greater number of patents, 50,000, okay, in table 4 relative to what, 36,000 in table 3. You've got active solid state devices, okay, again, similar things, right at the top in both tables, okay. So this is IT revolution, you can see pretty clearly, okay, just by looking at the patent classification. And this is what I mean by you can use, you can look at patent data to gauge the evolution of the economic structure around the world. Okay, so now the next question I wanted to ask is how Korea has been doing across these different classes, different technologies. Okay, this is just an attempt to give you the numbers, the simple count. Okay, and you've got on the x-axis, you've got countries. And on the y-axis, you've got the number of simple counts, patent count. And class 1 is the first table, class 2 is the second table, class 3 is the third table, class 4 is the fourth table. But what we do is class 1 technologies, okay, class 1 related, the 10 most popular technologies in decade 1, you count the patents of those patents, not just in the first decade, but also in second, third, and fourth decades, okay? Because these technologies are not, may not be as popular, but they're still important, okay? Fertilizers are still important. Chemistry is still important. It may not be just as hot, okay, as they once used to be, okay? So that's what we do. So class 1 technologies, how Korea is doing. So if you look at Korea, where is it? It's sort of 8th along the x-axis. And what you want to look at is the yellow dot. Where is the yellow dot? Yellow dot is how Korea is performing in the 10 most popular technologies of the first decade of the 70s in 2006 and 2015, okay? So the yellow dot tells how Korea is doing in terms of old technologies now, okay? And you want to compare the class 1 table at the top left with class 4 table at the bottom right. And you want to look at the yellow dots in those two tables and make the comparison. You can see that the yellow dot for Korea, okay? So can you see my pointer?
Yes.
So here there's yellow, sort of pretty much stuck to the x-axis, Korea. But then with class 4 technologies, it's much different. Okay, so you can sort of see from this table that Korea is really doing a lot more in terms of class 4 technologies, the most popular technologies in the latest decade. Similar story with class 3 technologies. Okay, so Korea, by looking at these tables, okay, a bit complicated, I admit, but basically I want to tell you is that by just looking at simple count only, you can tell that where Korea is producing is in class 3 and class 4 technologies. Okay, the new things, not the old things. Okay, that's basically it. Natural, obviously. I just want to confirm this with pattern data. That's all I'm doing. Okay. Okay, so I want to introduce HIndex to the previous calculations, right? So this is HIndex imposed on class 1 technologies, the 10 most popular technologies of the 70s, if you like, and country rankings. US, Japan, always number 1, 2 in all these things, okay? Korea, steadily not so good, okay? Korea steadily not so good, 15, 13, 12, 11, okay? Below other competing countries. Okay.
So Jihong, as a timekeeper in this room, so could you wrap up the presentation within the 5 minutes so that we can move to the Q&A? Thank you.
Okay, so this is pretty much the last thing. Okay, so the point is, Korea is producing in IT type industries, okay, in terms of quantity that I've just shown, but also in terms of HIndex, but the story is not as impressive when it comes to HIndex relative to the quantity, okay? But still, if you look at just class 3 and class 4 technologies, the latest numbers for Korea, 7.6 here, are better than the overall. And you can see why, because Korea is more focused on these newer technologies. Okay, so the overall ranking for at the rightmost column was lower, but if you just look at class 4 technologies, it's number 6. Okay, so let's forget about all this. This is doing the same thing with what's known as fourth industrial revolution type technologies. Similar story because they're all IT stuff. Okay, so final thing I want to tell you is that who are then these innovators? Okay, Korea has grown by innovation since the sort of mid-90s by focusing on IT and fourth industrial revolution type technologies. Okay, quantity has drastically improved. Quality has improved too, but not quite as impressively as in terms of quantity. But who are driving these things? Well, these are the numbers of patent counts by companies since 2000 to 2015. Korea produced 134,000 patents in the US between 2000 and 2015. 60,000 of them went to Samsung companies. There are 19 Samsung companies with at least one patent, but mostly Samsung Electronics. LG, 26,000. So these two companies, 86,000 out of 130,000. Huge concentration of innovation activities. Okay. So Lotte is like one of the top 10 group of companies, just really minimal number of patents. So let me wrap up. Korea has steadily improved its position in global innovation ladder, quality improvement, as well as quantity improvement, although quality not so impressive. We use patent classification system to disaggregate the measure We observe IT revolution starting from the 1990s. And it's really in this area where Korea has excelled and focused. So then the question is, will this trend continue? I have some worries. Why? Because despite the overall growth, Korea's performance is sort of specific to certain areas. So if you look at the tables a bit more carefully, other countries have more evenly spread rankings across classes 1 to between classes 1 and 4. Korea has more stark differences across those tables. Okay, so it concentrates on particular line of research, and that is obviously not perfect, especially in the time of risks. Also, the last table I showed you was that the concentration was not just in terms of the area of research, but also in terms of who does the research. I think this might be even more of a problem. Okay, so that's all I have to say today. Sorry I went, a bit longer than I thought I would.
No, it was the perfect timing. Thank you so much. So thank you for fantastic presentation. So we have learned a lot from the findings with the big data. So as an audience, we just see the numbers, but I mean, you must be the collecting the tons of the data to generate the single table in your presentation. So I would appreciate it if you can stop sharing your screen. Thank you. So if you have any questions, again, please feel free to review your question on the Q&A box on the Zoom. So as a moderator, so I will start with the one question I had. So I have a question about the collaboration between the firms and universities. So I'm in San Diego. So engineering and the medical departments here in the UC San Diego have a very close relationship with the big firms here in San Diego, say Qualcomm or Illumina. So I want to learn from you how does it work? Are there the active collaboration between the big business groups and universities like Seoul National Universities? So yeah, so what do you think about that?
There are many collaborations between companies and universities in Korea. But what I do not yet know is how to track it in the pattern data. I haven't looked at it, or we haven't looked at it yet. Okay, so I know that there are lots of activities, but I don't know how much of that has been translated to pattern data. That I do not know. Okay, so that's my response. So
yeah, I mean the quick follow-up. So in the patent data, is there any information about the university?
Oh, sure. I mean, you can look at assignee information, inventor information, all those things to gauge that, but we just haven't been able to do that. Well, we could, but you have to look at the individual data, the co-authors and things like that. A lot of people have done that in the US and in Europe. So one of the purposes of co-PDP is for people to do that if interested. All the data is available freely.
Okay, thank you. So while waiting for the questions popping up on the Q&A box, let me first check if the panelists joining us today have any questions.
Yeah, I can ask one. It's always fun to ask questions in a field that you know very little about. But look, I took this as a largely descriptive exercise that was focused on a particular point, which is that South Korea appears to be lagging in quantity compared to quality. But I think it might benefit from a dynamic interpretation, because I would assume at the beginning of a country's patent life cycle, so to speak, that you would have more low quality patents initially, but then the question is, what is the share of higher quality patents over time? And so even though Korea at this particular juncture may show more quantity than quality, the interesting question might be, how does its quantity-quality ratio, so to speak, compare now compared to some previous period?
Yeah, so the HIndex, or the ranking of it across countries, was the most simple attempt to reflect it. There are many ways of doing what you asked, because the citation distribution itself is highly skewed.
Yeah,
only
right.
Very few patents get every citation.
Right.
So in this literature, people only look at top 10% of a given distribution of citations as innovative patents.
Right.
Okay, so
many patents aren't cited at all, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, we've done some work on that too. And who are the, and where are these really innovative patents? Much the same. Okay, so you can track that. Okay, yeah. So that's one response. But that quality is improving. Okay, over time. It's just not as impressively as a quantity, but the quantity has really increased. Okay, so if we were to think about the ratio, I think it may have gone. I wouldn't be surprised if that ratio, good versus everything, might have fallen. Okay.
Yeah. But that would be, I think, important for the point you're making. I think showing that over time would be useful.
So it's important that you're right. It's important that quality has to be taken into account. I think that's what you're saying. But this, what we call, I forget the term. But anyway, these uncited patent is an issue in the US too.
Right.
Okay, so there are lots of people in the US who say that the patent system has been broken. Okay, right. There are too many unworthy patents around.
Yeah. Well, it's a function of our legal system. I have another question, but I'm going to hold because there are others in the queue. But do come back to me, Munseob, if you want another idea.
So there is the one interesting question from the audience, and then I will go back to the panels. So the one question is that, so the one attendee found that the Japan is the highly ranked than the Korea for all classes. I think he or she meant the class 1 to 4. So what do they do differently? So what makes the difference in the research performance between the Korea and Japan, two countries next to each other geographically, I mean?
So the first answer is that Japan is actually a bigger country than Korea. Okay, Japan is population-wise, land mass-wise, more than twice as big. Okay, and they went through industrial revolution much earlier than Korea, from the 19th century. Okay. So they can do lots of things because of the size. You might think that Korea has improved and caught up with Japan, and my hunch is that the answer is no, really. Okay, not really. Okay, maybe in a few things, but overall, across the board, Japanese innovation ecosystem is just as strong as ever. Okay. The size is different, history is different, that I know, but in terms of more detail, I do not have access to the Japanese patent data. Okay, so we can get into European stuff, European patents, but in Japan, we don't really know. But the two basic things I can say.
Okay. So now we are going back to the panelists. Any question, Jungmin?
So I have a follow-up question. So Jihong mentioned countryside as a factor for the difference between Japan and Korea. So for the same reason, I wonder how you think about the degree of concentration. So you're worried about the concentration too concentrated, basically to two companies. But we are a small country, so I wonder, how much we should be worried about the level of concentration.
Good. I have another paper looking at that exactly. So we've looked at, in another paper, we've looked at Korea, Taiwan, Japan, China. Okay, and we're looking at the citation data to track who is citing whom. In particular, where are Chinese patents coming from? Who do they cite? Okay, and the answer is Taiwan. Okay, Taiwan. Korean patents began to cite the Japanese patents most. Okay, so there's another paper with this. And while doing this, okay, that was the main question of that paper. What we wanted to do was look at the differential market structures across these four countries. Okay, Korea highly concentrated. Okay, Taiwan not so concentrated. Okay, more small companies spread it out. Okay, both countries are highly concentrated in similar IT areas, okay? But in terms of market structure, behind the area concentration is very different across the two countries. China, I can tell you, is also highly concentrated in IT stuff because Chinese technologies came from Taiwan who are concentrated, okay? But Chinese, maybe because of the size, in terms of market structure, much more evenly spread. Japan, on the other hand, evenly spread in both counts, both in terms of technologies that we've already seen, but in terms of market structure too. Okay, so I hope that answers your question somewhat.
Okay, so there are two questions in queue on the Q&A box. The first question is a yes or no question, the data question. Whether the Korean patent data also provides the information about the inventor, individual level. So is it yes or no?
No, the answer is the data can be accessed, the raw data can be accessed. We basically, there are some copyright issues. So we provide codes to get that data. And also, provide various codes to how to crawl different information from the text data of patents. Okay, so there are some refined data Excel files or CSV files, but we don't provide everything. Okay.
Yeah, okay, thank you. And I will move to the next question, which is very interesting, by the Hanbyul Lee. So can increase in quantity be perceived as a sort of intention to preempt? If that's the case, the few innovators are perhaps clogging the ecosystem so that other new innovators cannot emerge. So there is nothing I can add. I mean, this is a good question. So yeah, so the floor is yours.
People using patents to block entry, that idea is an old idea in IO. It goes back to Gilbert Newbery of 1982, okay? So people do that, but this is not restricted to Korean companies. This happens everywhere, okay? I don't know, I haven't looked into the Korean company behavior, but strategically speaking, if they do that, others will do that too. So that using patents to preempt and deter entry, that's an old idea. It's an idea in terms of explaining reality. Okay, that's what economics is about. It's just we just explain what goes on in the world. So my guess is that if Samsung does that, then Intel does that too.
Okay, so Delani, do you have any question?
No, actually, my question was similar to the Japan one. I was wondering, I guess your perspective was more, hopefully I'm not interpreting wrong, pessimistic about how much Korea is going to continue growing. Is that kind of what you were saying in terms of patent specialization?
It's concentration breeds pessimism because of its position against risk. Okay, if Samsung continues to grow, I have every belief in Samsung and LG, but if something happens to Samsung, then there's a trouble. So the pessimism is in terms of that uncertainty. Okay, so you know, not just in terms of market structure, but in terms of what we innovate. You know, you have to look at not just the mean, but also variance.
Okay, so we have a time for the one last question. So now I'm going back to Steph. You say that you have one more question.
Yeah, you know, I wondered if you thought of using network analysis for the purpose of a sort of descriptive account of the Korean structure, because, you know, you can treat each patent as a node and the citations as directed, you know, directed links in the network. And you've got information, for example, on the assignee. So you could ask questions like, do the Samsung patents depend on Samsung citations? Or you could ask the question in terms of nationality. You know, does the Korean network structure, is it more or less open than, let's say, Taiwan's network structure in terms of nationality? I mean, there are lots of interesting, just descriptive questions that could be asked using network analysis on this data, because you've got age, you've got nationality, you've got assignee.
Absolutely, Stefan. There are so many things that you can do. There's so many things that people have done and have been doing with US data, NBR, PDP, and all kinds of developments after that. So the very idea of co-PDP is to facilitate that kind of researchers. You know, if people are interested in doing this thing, you know, they can, okay? With regard to networks, yes, I haven't done it myself, but one of my students did that for his undergraduate thesis for maths department. Okay, so he brought some new network algorithm, superimposed it onto our data set, and produced some amazing pictures. Okay.
The one interesting question might be the dependence, you know, of the larger firms on their own patents.
Yeah.
And whether that's a sort of, you know, so instead of going to smaller firms or outside firms for citations, you know, a concentration within the group would sort of be potentially be another downside of chaebol structure, right?
Very good. That question we've done, but not with a network structure. Okay, there's no network structure, but just looking at who cites, so in a much more kind of crude way. Okay, that we have done. Okay, we haven't published it, but we are roughly there. Okay, so big farms only cite big farms.
Yeah.
Okay, and some small farms or medium-sized farms, but small and medium-sized farms never cite the big farms. Okay,
yeah.
This we know from Korean data, Korean patent data. Okay, that I know, that I can tell you, but this is not from network analysis. Okay, so we just divide the companies not in terms of individual nodes like you described, but sort of broadly into 3 or 4 different groups. Okay, and see, you know, divide the sample into those sort of crude measures and see where the citations are across them. And that's what we found. That's what we found.
Yeah,
that
very interesting.
Yeah,
very interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So thank you, Jihong, for the great presentation. I mean, the who innovates in Korea is really the $1 trillion question. So, I mean, I feel that we saw the kind of you guys are kind of opening this black box, and we are looking forward to singing further because you also mentioned the new paper which is not published yet. So thank you all for coming, and then yeah, I hope to see some of you in the next SNU UC San Diego joint webinar scheduled in May. Thank you so much, Jihong. Thank you.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Thanks for coming.